The Park Café was a magnet for the city's elite, tucked between rows of manicured trees and the hum of a nearby fountain. It was midday and the café buzzed with life as waiters in crisp uniforms weaved gracefully between tables balancing trays of artisan dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air smelled of warm bread and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers, but for one man none of this seemed remarkable. At a prime table in the center sat Bernard Green, a name synonymous with power and wealth. He had built his empire from scratch, starting with real estate in his 20s and expanding into ventures that few could dream of. At 72 he carried himself with the confidence of someone who owned not just his world but perhaps the worlds of everyone around him. His sharp suit and gold-rimmed glasses reflected a life of opulence, yet as he glanced at the menu his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Opposite him sat Marissa, his much younger wife, a woman who seemed plucked straight out of a magazine cover. Her jet-black hair framed a face that was impossibly polished, her bright red lipstick carefully applied. Every inch of her screamed elegance, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She twirled a diamond bracelet on her wrist absent-mindedly, her attention fixed not on her husband but on her phone screen. Nearby a boy lingered just beyond the patio fence. He was small for his age, his oversized hoodie hanging loosely on his thin frame. His dark eyes darted from table to table, scanning plates and pockets, looking for an opportunity. His name was Malik, though no one in the cafe knew him. His face was familiar on this street, a kid with nowhere to go, always on the outskirts of conversations and the edges of concern. Bernard glanced at his watch and remarked that Marissa was distracted again, his voice calm but pointed. Marissa looked up and smiled, though there was no warmth in it, replying sweetly that she was right here and placing her hand on his, adding how much she enjoyed these lunches. Malik's stomach growled as he moved closer, his footsteps almost silent as he leaned against the patio railing. His eyes landed on Bernard's table, the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months, a pristine white bowl of soup flanked by fresh bread and a glass of sparkling water. But then something unusual happened. As Bernard adjusted his glasses and picked up his phone, Marissa's hand slipped into her designer handbag. Malik saw her fingers close around a small vial. She twisted it open with a casual flick, tilting her hand ever so slightly over the steaming bowl. The liquid blended with the soup in an instant, disappearing like it had never been there. Malik's breath caught as he froze, watching her stir the soup with the spoon, her expression unchanged. Then she leaned closer to Bernard, her voice low but just audible enough, saying that after all the trouble she'd gone through, he wouldn't ruin this now. The boy blinked, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Was this real? Could a woman who looked so perfect, sitting in a place so polished, really be doing what he thought? But Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. His heart pounded in his chest as he crouched lower behind the railing. He wasn't sure what he'd just seen, but the way the woman's voice carried those cold words sent a shiver through him. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. No one else had noticed, no one else had been paying attention. It was just him. The faint growl in his stomach pulled him back to reality, but his eyes remained fixed on the couple. Bernard looked tired and distracted, his spoon hovering over the bowl as he checked his phone. Marissa was all charm and poise again, her smile bright, her hand resting on her chin as if she hadn't just whispered something chilling moments ago. Malik could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His instinct screamed to walk away. Why get involved? Who would believe a kid like him, a boy in a threadbare hoodie standing at the edges of a world he wasn't welcome in? He swallowed hard, glancing around at the other patrons. Laughter, chatter, the clinking of glasses. No one cared, no one even noticed him. But his gaze returned to Bernard's spoon, now dipping into the soup. Malik felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just his imagination. He had seen her pour something into it. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. His thoughts raced. He didn't know this man, but that didn't matter. Wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly, and then without thinking Malik pushed himself off the railing and marched straight to the table. His legs felt like lead but his feet didn't stop. His voice cracked as he shouted not to eat that. Heads turned, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the clatter of a dropped fork echoed across the cafe. Bernard froze, his spoon inches from his lips, his wide eyes locking onto the boy. Marissa whipped her head around, her expression hardening as she demanded to know what he just said, her voice sharp enough to cut through glass. Malik didn't falter. His voice was shaky but loud enough for everyone to hear as he said she put something in the food, that he saw her, and not to eat it. Gasps rippled through the cafe as every patron turned toward the scene. The silence that followed was suffocating. Malik stood his ground, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. Bernard blinked, glancing between the boy and his wife, asking what he was talking about, his tone calm but his hand trembling as he set the spoon down on the table. Marissa's composure snapped like a rubber band stretched too thin. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, hissing that he was a little liar and demanding to know how he dared accuse her of something so vile and who even let him in here. The words stung, but Malik didn't back down. His eyes remained locked on Bernard's, desperate to make him see the truth. He said firmly that he saw her pour something into the soup when he wasn't looking, adding that he could smell it if he didn't believe him. Bernard's face paled as he turned toward his wife, his eyes narrowing as he asked what was going on. She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand and saying the boy was just trying to cause trouble, suggesting he probably just wanted money or food. She spat the words out like they were poison themselves, her gaze flicking to Malik with open disdain. But the boy didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his fists clenched, saying firmly that he wasn't lying and that she doesn't want him to know, but he saw everything. Bernard's hand lingered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and the gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. But something in the boy's tone made him hesitate. The air around the table seemed to thicken, the once lively cafe now eerily silent. All eyes were locked on the unfolding drama, their meals forgotten. Bernard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the boy with a scrutinizing gaze. His face bore the marks of a man used to people playing games with him, trying to take advantage of his wealth, but this was different. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look away. Bernard asked if his name was Malik, his voice steady though a trace of suspicion lingered. The boy nodded, saying yes and insisting he was telling the truth, pleading with him not to eat it. Marissa let out a harsh laugh, crossing her arms as she stared Malik down, calling it absurd and claiming he was just some street kid looking for attention, questioning whether Bernard was really going to entertain this nonsense. But Bernard didn't answer her. Instead he picked up the spoon again, this time holding it closer to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from the quiet storm brewing within him. He said her name slowly, his eyes meeting hers, telling her that she heard the boy and asking what exactly was going on. Marissa's mask of poise cracked further, her lips pressing into a thin line as she said she couldn't believe he was even asking her that, calling it insulting. She turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising as she insisted the boy was lying, suggesting he probably didn't even know who Bernard was and questioning why he would trust him over her. The weight of her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the effect she'd hoped for. The crowd was murmuring now, their eyes darting between the three of them. Whispers floated through the air questioning whether she really did it, noting that she seemed nervous and observing that the boy didn't look like he was making it up. The murmurs only fueled Marissa's fury. She slammed her hands on the table, her polished demeanor gone, saying that was enough and demanding Bernard eat his soup so they could leave, her voice trembling with rage. But Malik wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched tightly, saying that if Bernard wouldn't believe him then he should call someone to test it, his voice rising with urgency. He pointed out that Bernard was rich and had lawyers and doctors, people who could figure it out, but pleaded with him not to eat it, warning he would regret it. Bernard's jaw tightened as he turned back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand but he didn't lift it to his lips. His eyes, tired and calculating, shifted to his wife. He said her name again, his voice low, noting that she'd been acting strange for weeks and questioning whether this was it. Her face flushed and she stumbled over her words, insisting she didn't know what he was talking about and asking if he could seriously think she would poison him. Bernard finished her sentence for her, his tone razor sharp. The crowd gasped audibly, their whispers growing louder. Malik stood firm, his gaze unwavering. He could feel his heart pounding but he wouldn't let it show. He'd done what he could. Now it was up to Bernard to make the next move. Marissa straightened up, her expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. She said it was ridiculous and that she didn't have to sit there and listen to this nonsense, grabbing her handbag. But before she could leave, Bernard's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. He said firmly that she wasn't going anywhere, not until they got to the bottom of this. The waiter who had been frozen in place finally spoke up, asking if he should call the police. The question sent a ripple through the cafe, and for the first time Marissa looked genuinely panicked. She shook her head violently, telling them not to dare and insisting it was just a misunderstanding, appealing to Bernard. But Bernard raised his hand, silencing her, and said yes, addressing the waiter without looking away from Marissa, telling him to call them. Malik felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. The truth wasn't out yet and the tension was far from over. The cafe held its collective breath as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Bernard let go of Marissa's wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. The once polished charm she wore so effortlessly was now unraveling, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. She glanced around, her lips moving but no sound coming out, as if searching for an escape. Meanwhile Malik stood a few steps back, his hands shaking slightly. He'd done all he could, but now he felt the weight of doubt creeping in. What if the man didn't believe him after all? What if she managed to talk her way out of this? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. Bernard said Malik's name suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension, telling him that he said he saw her put something in the soup and asking if he could describe it. The boy nodded quickly, stepping forward and explaining it was a small bottle like one you'd use for medicine with clear liquid, that she poured it in when he was looking at his phone then stirred it, swearing he saw it. Bernard's face tightened. He turned to Marissa, who was already shaking her head, calling it absurd and insisting the boy was lying, questioning why she would do such a thing. But Bernard cut her off, asking why the boy would lie and what he could possibly gain from this. The crowd murmured again, and the sound of sirens in the distance added to the charged atmosphere. Marissa's eyes darted toward the soup, and for a split second her carefully crafted facade slipped completely. She looked cornered. Then, as if grasping at straws, she rounded on Malik, accusing him of spying on them and trying to cause trouble because he was jealous of people who actually had something. The words hit Malik like a slap, but he stood his ground, saying firmly that he wasn't jealous and that he saw what he saw and couldn't just stand there and let her hurt him. The sirens grew louder, and soon 2 police officers entered the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, their hands resting on their belts. One of them asked what was going on, his tone neutral but authoritative. Bernard stood, his towering frame still commanding respect despite his age. He told the officers he needed them to take a look at this, gesturing toward the bowl of soup and explaining that the boy claimed his wife poisoned it. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions carefully blank. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, then turned to Marissa, asking if she had anything to say about this. Her face turned crimson as she insisted it was ridiculous and that he was just a street kid trying to make trouble, questioning whether Bernard was really going to let this nonsense go that far. But the officer wasn't buying her deflection. He said they needed to test the contents, reaching for the bowl. Marissa snapped no, her voice rising. The outburst drew even more attention, and her sudden panic only made her look guiltier. The officer paused, narrowing his eyes and asking if there was something she'd like to tell them before they proceeded. Marissa hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at Bernard, then at the officers, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. Finally her resolve crumbled. She spat fine, her voice low but dripping with venom, saying they wanted the truth and that she was tired of living in his shadow, tired of his control over everything. She said he was never supposed to make it past this year and then stopped abruptly, realizing too late that she'd said too much. The cafe erupted in gasps, some patrons pulling out their phones to record the scene. Bernard's face went pale as the weight of her confession hit him like a truck. The officer stepped forward, his expression grim, telling her he was placing her under arrest for attempted murder and instructing her to put her hands where he could see them. Marissa's composure shattered completely. She screamed, trying to wriggle free as they secured her hands behind her back, shouting that they didn't understand and that she deserved everything he had, everything. Her voice echoed through the stunned cafe as they led her away, her protests fading into the distance. Bernard sank back into his chair, his hand trembling as he pushed the soup away. For a moment he said nothing, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. Then his eyes found Malik, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. But as Bernard's gaze softened, a flicker of gratitude replaced the anger in his expression. Malik hadn't just saved his life, he'd revealed a truth Bernard would have never seen coming. The cafe slowly returned to a low hum of whispers and murmurs as the officers escorted Marissa out. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Bernard with pity, others with curiosity. But Malik didn't move, he stood rooted to the spot, unsure if he was supposed to stay or slip away quietly. Bernard turned to the boy, his face still pale but his eyes now steady, saying his name softly and gesturing to the seat across from him, telling him to sit. Malik hesitated, glancing around at the onlookers, but Bernard's voice carried a weight that made him obey. Slowly he sank into the chair, his shoulders tense. Bernard told him he saved his life, his voice low but firm, adding that he didn't know how he could ever repay him. Malik fidgeted, his hands gripping the edge of the table, saying he just couldn't let it happen, that he couldn't just watch and say nothing. Bernard nodded, his gaze distant for a moment as if replaying the entire ordeal in his mind. He said that most people would have, that they would have turned the other way and pretended they didn't see, but that Malik didn't, and that took courage. Malik shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper, saying he guessed he just didn't like seeing people get hurt, that was all. Bernard leaned back, studying the boy. For the first time he seemed to really see him, not just as a scrappy kid on the streets but as someone with a story, a soul. He asked how long Malik had been out there. The question caught Malik off guard. He looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment as he said a while. Bernard frowned but didn't press. Instead he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone, telling Malik to wait there as he stepped aside to make a call. Malik watched him, unsure of what to do. His heart pounded with anxiety. Was he in trouble now? Was Bernard going to call someone to have him removed? But when Bernard returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. He said help was on the way. Malik asked what he meant by help, his brow furrowing. Bernard nodded, explaining he called someone he trusted who would make sure Malik had a place to sleep tonight, somewhere safe, and that if he'd let him, he'd like to do more than that. The boy's eyes widened. He said quickly that Bernard didn't have to do that, his voice defensive, insisting he didn't do this for money or anything. Bernard smiled faintly, saying he knew, and that was why he wanted to help. He told Malik that he did something most people wouldn't have, and that if the world had more people like him, it would be a much better place. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt a warmth he couldn't quite describe. He looked down, unsure of what to say. The cafe patrons began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Bernard picked up his glass of water, taking a long sip before speaking again, saying that sometimes life gives us the chance to change someone else's story, his voice thoughtful. He told Malik that he changed his today, and maybe just maybe he could help change Malik's. The boy glanced up at him, his dark eyes glistening with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. As the two sat in silence, the sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows across the cafe. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the event. Courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy. Sometimes it's the people we overlook who have the greatest strength of all. In the end, Malik's bravery didn't just save a life, it reminded everyone in that cafe of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds.